The Covenant, a religious authority of various races throughout the Milky Way galaxy that seek nothing more than to ascend and begin their great journey. Within the Covenant, there exists a hierarchy consisting of the Sangheili at the top, the Sangheili under them, then the Jiralhanae, Huragok, Lekgolo, Yanme'e, Kig-yar, and finally the Unggoy. Among all of these exists the collective history of the Covenant, each race's individual history, and even their mythology. I'd like to point out that some of these races have a more fleshed out history and mythology than some of the others due to their importance throughout the series. But as you'll see later on, each shares distinct connections to the religious and mythical influences that make up this hegemony. Going over my research into this, I realized that there is a lot to what makes up the Covenant, not only in their individual histories and mythologies, but their ranks, weaponry, tactics, and vehicles, all of which I plan on exploring in further videos. To better understand the myths and legends of the Covenant, I want to first explain not only the series itself, but the Covenant's singular and shared desire. So, without further ado, let's begin.
Stay with the Master Chief. He'll know what to do.
Yes, sir, Sergeant.
Thanks for the tank. He never gets me anything.
Oh, I know what the ladies like.
Following the numerical order of the games, Halos 1, 2, and 3, you play as an augmented human, who is known primarily as the Master Chief. Flying through deep space, you discover ancient ring worlds that were made by an extinct race of beings known as the Forerunners. Along your journey, you encounter the Covenant, the conglomerate of races wanting to activate the rings, not fully realizing what is hiding within the depths of the ring. An even more ancient collective that infects and devours whole worlds. Upon destroying the ring, known as Installation 04, you return to Earth, but run into more trouble, as the Covenant unwittingly discovers humanity's homeworld. By this time, the Covenant itself is beginning to fracture, and a great schism is taking place within the holy city known as High Charity. Taking on the role of a dishonored elite called the Arbiter, alongside the Master Chief, you discover that the leaders of the Covenant are willing to sacrifice everything and everyone to activate the rings. Returning to Earth, you learn that the ancient Forerunners had built a portal on the planet to a distant machine world designated Installation 00, known colloquially as the Ark. Existing outside the Milky Way, it's here that all 7 rings can be activated simultaneously. Unfortunately, what followed both humanity and the Covenant to the Ark was the devouring collective known as the Flood. Desiring the array to not be activated to prevent its death, the Flood briefly aids in dismantling the Covenant. As the Ark is a foundry for the rings, both the Master Chief and the Arbiter fire a newly formed installation within the Ark's atmosphere, subsequently destroying not only the ring and the Ark, but the Flood as well, leaving the galaxy in a moment of peace for the races of the Covenant and humanity to rebuild.
The Prophet of Regret is planning to activate Halo.
Are you sure?
I shall light this holy ring, release its cleansing flame, and burn a path into the divine beyond.
Pretty much.
Spoken about constantly throughout the main games as well as some of the spin-offs is the Covenant's desire to begin something known as the Great Journey. This is the central religion within the Covenant Empire that drives their every move to achieve transcendence. Its core belief stems from the main artifacts that have been found throughout the many planets and systems within the Milky Way, showing up primarily on the planets that have substantial and intelligent life on them. These artifacts that were found were made by beings known as the Forerunners, a highly advanced race that many within the Covenant believed to be gods. Upon finding the sacred rings, the Covenant, or more specifically the Sangheili, believed that activating these sacred rings allowed their perceived gods, the Forerunners, to ascend into complete godhood. apart from their corporeal selves and existing as one with the cosmos. As I mentioned before, it was the Sangheili who were the originators of the Covenant and the belief of the Great Journey, seeing all who weren't believers of the higher power of the Forerunners as inferior. In the efforts to expand the religious fervor of ascension, the Sangheili would run into the different races that would make up the future of the Covenant, starting with the Sangheili, Huragok, then the Lekgolo, the Yanme'e, Kig-yar, Unggoy, then finally the Jiralhanae. Here we'll be exploring the first of the two races, the Sangheili and the Sangheili.
Halo, its divine wind will rush through the stars, propelling all who are worthy along the path to salvation.
As a race of humanoid worm-like beings, the Sangheili have a complex history with the Forerunners and their technology. I won't go into full detail on that here, but it is something that I plan on covering in a different video. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out. Looking at the race of the prophets, they're known as well by their Latin name, Perfidia vermis, meaning treacherous worms. This is fitting, as it's the prophets who commit the most treachery amongst the Covenant, bickering between the races and allowing others to maim or dismantle any opposition, as seen with the Jiralhane's takeover and the Unggoy rebellion. But more on that later. In myth, worms are seen as some of the most evil of the monsters, primarily recognized as dragons or serpents during antiquity. There are a few that are quite notable. In Norse mythology, Nidhogg is a worm, spelled with a Y, and a serpent-like dragon, one that lives among the roots of the Tree of Life, Yggdrasil, roaming atop the realm of the dead known as Niflheim. Nidhogg is known to bite the roots of the tree and devour the dead. Worms are especially recognized within Old English, as seen with the Epic of Beowulf. Being the third and final monster fought within the epic, Beowulf faces a fierce dragon alone, where the story states, "The poison breath of that foul worm first came forth from the cave. Hot reek of fight, the rocks resounded." This provides a view on how dangerous these worms were believed to be, as the dragons could not only breathe fire, but could emit a noxious gas to poison their foes. This is what's seen within the Covenant as the prophets lie and poison the minds of the other races, making them upend thousands of years of history and mythology to assimilate to the Sangheili's beliefs and desires. Living as the hierarchs and highest members within the Covenant, they oftentimes take up a role known as the prophet, who are said to commune specifically with the ancient gods that they worship, formulating the theology that the Covenant follows with such enthusiasm. In many religions around the world, the role of prophet has been seen as a divinely inspired person who is able to communicate with the deities of their faith, serving as the middleman between a singular god or many gods and the people who worship them. This role has been seen in not only Abrahamic religions such as Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, but as well in the ancient Greeks, as conveyors of prophecy and unseen knowledge given divinely. The prophets used their status and capabilities to establish rule and law within their following. Some of the most notable prophets in history include Muhammad, Moses, Abraham, and Jesus Christ, all of whom were committed to the covenant established by God to establish rule and law, as well as providing a guide to one's salvation. However, I should mention that within Christianity especially, a concept called the false prophet is highly significant, as this is something that can twist, deceive, or even falsify the given word of the divine. As seen in Matthew 24:24, it states, "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray if possible, even the elect. I mention this as with the prophets of truth, regret, and mercy, they are all false prophets, leading their following not to a heavenly transcendence, but to their complete end. It's worth noting as well that each of the prophets of the covenant are exact opposites of the virtue that they themselves represent. The prophet of mercy is quick to judge and act without mercy. The prophet of regret acts and speaks without a filter, showing no regret for his words. And nearly all of truth's lines spoken are lies or half-truths, ringing true to the term false prophet. In their lives, both before the covenant and during it, the prophets' race of the Sangheili lived a life of pleasure. Otherwise known as hedonism, they sought self-indulgence over other pursuits, as many of the hierarchs viewed themselves with higher intent than many of the other races. To the Greeks, living as a hedonist was seen as being a worshipper of the goddess and personification of pleasure and enjoyment, Hedone. Born from Eros, the personification of love, and Psyche, the personification of the soul, Hedone focused more on the sensual and personal side of pleasure, and is the root to the term hedonism, or the act of being hedonistic. Many of the Stoics during the time that Hedone was worshipped were entirely against the goddess's worship, viewing both the personification and the thought behind hedonism, or self-indulgence, as being against the natural order and without proper reason. This falls in line with how the Sangheili originally viewed the Forerunner technology upon their discovery. The Stoics among the race, seeing the tampering with the advanced technology as against natural law and reason. However, the reformers that opposed them desired to learn and advance from its discovery. This technology that was found by the Sangheili is actually the Forerunner ship that we see within High Charity during the final missions of Halo 2.
This armor suits you, but it cannot hide that mark. Nothing ever will. You are the arbiter, the will of the prophets. But these are my elites. Their lives matter to me, yours does not. That makes two of us.
Known as the elites to humans, the Sangheili are a bipedal saurian race of warriors that have been seen as the primary enemies throughout the Halo series. This race is extremely prideful and honor-bound in any actions they take part in. Up until the Great Schism in 2552, the Sangheili were primarily the military force within the Covenant for thousands of years. Originating from the planet Sanghelios within the Urs system, the Sangheili live within what we would refer to as city-states, or polis, similar to how the ancient Greeks lived. Unsurprisingly, the Sangheili are believed to be a polytheistic society, meaning that they worship more than one god. One god within their pantheon in particular, and more than likely their central god, was Urs, the same name as the star Sanghelios revolved around. Being a sun god, Urs is seen as the most ancient within the Sangheili's pantheon. This divinity is nearly identical to many other sun gods seen throughout the many religions and cults of worship around the earth. In Egyptian mythology, the sun god Ra was seen as the single most important god. Being the ruler of the sky, the earth, and even the underworld for a time, Ra was seen as a creator of all things within Egyptian religion, growing crops for farmers and providing warmth for all life on and in the earth. Worshipped throughout Egypt's history until the Arab conquest in 639 CE, many celebrated their sun god with the care of his embodiment, the Menvis bull, sitting in the center of Heliopolis, one of the major cities of ancient Egypt. Giving the name for both Sanghelios and Egypt's Heliopolis is the Greek personification of the sun, Helios. Being a Titan god of ancient Greece, Helios was born from the Titans Hyperion and Theia, the Titans of the bright sky and sight, respectively. Helios was worshipped not only for the warmth and light that he brought with the sun, but as well for being the god of oaths, as many during the late antiquity in both Greece and Rome would swear oaths under the shining sun. Helios' worship was turbulent throughout ancient Greece, as his prominence was substantial in the pre-classical era between 800 to 500 BCE, then diminishing during Greece's Golden Age sometime after that, and growing again some 400 years later. His prominence was so profound during the pre-classical era that the city of Rhodes crafted a colossus in his honor, creating one of the ancient wonders of the world. In addition to the worship of the sun god of ancient Greece is the actual name of the star that Sanghelios revolves, Urs, as the term Urs is used mainly in both the Middle East and India as the celebration of the anniversary of the death of a Sufi saint. In Islamic worship, Sufism is a sect of mysticism that focuses on the purification of both the person's mind and body. With Urs, a saint who followed Sufism within Islam would spread the message of God and spread Islam's influence to new people and new regions. These saints would then be venerated and celebrated both in life and death, providing a sense of honor to any who followed them or expanded their work. This is not far off from what is learned about with the Sangheili, as their view on death is wholly sentimental and extremely honorable, with many of their fights against humanity being held in close quarters, as their weapon of choice was the energy sword, allowing combatants to battle face to face, desiring above all else to draw first blood. According to Sangheili tradition and belief, blood was integral to their way of life, being not only the substance that kept them alive, but was viewed in a ritualistic manner, as blood could only be spilled on the battlefield. In any other case of Sangheili blood leaving the body, it was seen as intolerable and without honor. Like many other religions around the world, the spilling of one's own blood, or in other words, suicide, was extremely frowned upon and went against the core values of their society. This is something that I'll be explaining at a different point in time. Unsurprisingly, the view on blood is not far off from what we know within humanity's early history. Much like how the Sangheili were a warrior culture, the Greeks, namely the Spartans, had this same view and belief on blood. Viewing it as holy by many, they believed that if weapons were drawn in any setting, combat must be had, as weapons demanded blood. However, where they differed is in the view of medicine and even philosophy, as many who studied blood or thought about it believed in both red and black blood. The red blood was obviously the blood that flowed through the body and gave a body its breath, according to Hippocrates. However, the black blood, as Plato thought, was a bile of sorts, a formation of disease that can infect the mind of any person should it reach the top of someone's head, known as the crown. Again, this view on blood is not uncommon in other religions as well. Within Aztec mythology and cosmology, the sun god Huitzilopochtli battled against the darkness of the sky for eons. To combat this and aid their sun god, priests would claim human sacrifices in the name of their god, cutting out the hearts and collecting the blood in order to feed Huitzilopochtli, maintaining the status quo that the bright light of day brought. In Christianity, for instance, blood is seen as a holy relic, and once again stands firm on the belief that spilling one's own blood could condemn the person to eternal damnation. In contrast, to drink the blood of the Savior is to be saved and earn a place within the kingdom of heaven. This concept actually created the communion that is still practiced today as ingesting the bread or the body of Christ and drinking of the sacramental wine or the blood of Christ solidifies the covenant of man and God. This brings up our next point, the beginning of the covenant, as it was the Sangheili who were the first race to join the covenant of races. After years of fighting against the Sanshayum and losing thousands of lives, if not millions, the Sanshayum and Sangheili chartered a peace agreement, establishing a codependency and creating the religious society that would become the covenant, sharing and assimilating the Sanshayum's beliefs and religious practices. What I find interesting is the use of the term covenant in relation to this union, as what could have easily been used instead could have been confederation, alliance, or even a coalition. But covenant is the title that they landed on. The reasoning for this is that many of the other terms have a more political or military union of two factions or tribes, while the term covenant establishes a religious union between the two, allowing the military and political side to take a more supporting role. The most common depiction of a covenant in religion is within the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Seen within the books Genesis, Exodus, 2 Samuel, and Matthew, we see depictions of covenants being made between man and God. Specifically in Genesis 9, 8-17, God proclaims to Noah his faithful task of creating the ark. As well within Exodus 19, 5-6, Moses is asked to keep his faith and guide his people to salvation to find the Holy Lands. As well, within the pre-Islamic days, as the Prophet Muhammad was growing in his belief, the Arab factions of Awaz and Khazraj fought for years before finally settling their differences in the name of Islam, becoming the Ansar or helpers together, creating a religious covenant between the two in honor of their faith. This is not far off from the fighting and the unification of the Sanshayum and the Sangheili in the name of religious worship and advancement, which was only possible due to the efforts of the most sacred of the Sangheili warriors, the Arbiter. As the fiercest and highest ranking among the Sangheili warriors, the Arbiter held immense power and authority over much of the military and even the politics on the planet, meaning the one who judges. The role of the Arbiter would be the one who would seal the future of their race, being the one who joined his forces with the Sanshayum, codifying the future of the Covenant. In researching this, I found that the original name of the Arbiter was going to be Dervish. However, as it was too close to the religious context, Bungie decided to change it to the Arbiter. In Islam, the term Dervish refers to a member within Sufism who devoted their life to poverty to focus on the universal values of love and service to God. What's interesting is that many viewed the dervish as miracle workers, or supernatural persons able to sway both political and military movements in their favor, or, in other words, in God's favor. Within the Abrahamic religions, an arbiter was said to be a piercing angel who would test a person's resolve in their faith, scrutinizing their loyalty to determine if they were worthy to enter heaven. In addition, the arbiters were called accusers by some, including the Hebrews, as they would accuse people of their sins, judging them to see if they would crumble or strengthen their resolve in their faith. The most notable arbiter, in especially the Christian faith, was Satan, as he is consistently testing man's resolve in efforts to gain their souls, seeing whether man was worthy of heaven or fit for hell. In the trial of Job, we see this play out in detail as God makes a deal to Satan to prove that man's faith is untouchable. In brief, Job begins his life with good wealth, excellent health, a large family, and friends who support him. However, God slowly strips away all of Job's fortune, his family, his health, and his friends, leaving Job with nothing, not even the shirt on his back. In this, Job learns of the vastness of God and the unknowable in his faith, but continues to maintain his worship, as Satan could no longer continue his accusations, and his role as an arbiter, he fades away, allowing God to return Job's wealth, return his health, return his family, and his friends as gifts. For the Covenant, the role of the arbiter is a testament to the strength of the Sangheili, but as the enforcer of the prophets, it is ultimately a test of the warrior's faith in the great journey. As we see within the opening of Halo 2, we learn with Thel Vidam that taking on the role of the arbiter means one's death, providing the prophets a means of control over the followers of the great journey, seeing if a high-ranking elite's resolve was with his brothers in arms or to the Covenant. The Halo series has had an ever-expanding universe that has been explored for over 20 years, and is going strong even to this day. Among the growing development of the series is the background of the many alien races that make up the hegemony of the Covenant, as many of the games, thanks to the Master Chief Collection, provide not only an updated look, but also additional history into the nuances within the games.
Everything we want to know about the Covenant, what they're looking for into the city, is right in here.
Being one of the oldest of the Covenant races, the Huragok were physically created by the Forerunners to aid in maintaining their equipment and technology. As biological supercomputers, the Huragok have a natural talent with technology. They're not only able to understand it with 100% accuracy, but are even able to integrate their own knowledge into the tech that they interact with. As seen with the Huragok, quick to adjust, who in Halo 3 ODST melded with the Superintendent Virgil, as well as the Huragok that was seen by the Master Chief in the book Halo: The Fall of Reach by Eric Nyland. By the way, if you haven't read this book, I'd highly recommend it. I don't believe it's canon anymore, but it's still an excellent look into the early days of the Halo series. With the Covenant, the Huragok played an extremely pivotal role as the engineers and maintenance workers aboard the many ships and holy city of High Charity, fulfilling the same role that they did with the Forerunners thousands of years prior to the events of the main series of games, being the hard-working laborers at every level within the Covenant, creating and advancing living quarters, weaponry, and space travel. However, the Huragok were slaves within the Covenant, as they had no real culture or religious beliefs, instead following whoever held the higher power, showing only real interest in the advancement and learning of machinery. For the Huragok, they resemble, in a lot of senses, the god of craftsmen and fire, Hephaestus. Worshipped throughout much of ancient Greece's history, Hephaestus was actively known as a lame or deformed god, expressing his notable difference to the rest of the gods on Olympus, who were deemed physically perfect and able-bodied. This relates to the Huragok as though they are able to move freely around the air due to their air sacs on their body, they don't walk in the conventional sense like the rest of the Covenant. As well, many of their names attest to how they function and move after birth, with names like Lighter Than Some and Quick to Adjust. In addition, Huragok, or engineers as referred to by humans, are master builders and craftsmen of not only weaponry, but as well architecture within the Covenant. With Hephaestus being the god of craftsmen, he built a number of different items, weapons, and architecture. Things like the bow and arrow of Apollo and Artemis, Zeus's lightning bolts, as well as a throne for Hera, which actually has a fascinating story. Being born from Hera alone, or Zeus and Hera, according to some myths, Hephaestus was seen as a deformed and improper child, and was subsequently thrown from Olympus. Surviving the fall, he grew up on the island of Lemnos, where he gathered materials and built a heavenly golden throne for his mother. When receiving the gift, Hera sat upon the golden throne, but was suddenly bound to it, unable to move. The other gods begged and pleaded with Hephaestus to release his mother, but in turn told them that he had no mother. It would be Zeus who would grant Hera's freedom by allowing Hephaestus to marry the goddess of beauty and love, Aphrodite. In terms of birth in relation to Hephaestus and the Huragok, many of the myths tell that Hera was the sole bearer of the god of fire. For the Huragok, they are capable of reproducing asexually, meaning that they don't typically need a male and a female to produce an offspring. Instead, the Huragok, either by themselves or with another, or sometimes even two others, come together gathering organic material and essentially build an offspring, all while inputting their collective knowledge. In both Hephaestus and the Huragok, a brilliant builder and smith is produced for both the Covenant and Olympus. Much like how Hera produced Hephaestus, the smith god produced a life of his own making, Pandora. As a gift for mankind, Hephaestus crafted Pandora from clay at the order of Zeus, in response to Prometheus stealing fire from the sacred forge on Olympus. However, Pandora was gifted with a pithos, or a Greek jar, and was told never to open it. Being naive and ever curious, Pandora secretly opened the jar and released untold horrors and evils upon the world. When she finally closed the jar, only hope remained inside. For the Huragok, they are not violent, and are oftentimes used as tools of war, typically being strapped with explosives to harm as many as possible in response to either their capture or as a last stand, connecting the two as weapons of a higher power. An interesting note is that the Huragok are not prevalent in the main series of games, Halos 1 through Infinite, but instead appear in the spin-off titles like ODST, Reach, and Halo Wars 1 and 2. The Huragok were first designed during Combat Evolved's production, where they resembled insectoid jellyfish or something closer to floating slugs. Slugs which, again, don't follow a set of beliefs or customs, and instead follow whoever had authority over them. A mentality and ethic that would see the Huragok go back and forth between the Covenant and humanity during their 28-year war. This attitude towards jumping between alliances or being unable to maintain one specific allegiance is reminiscent of the sea slug in Japanese folklore. According to one story, in the time during the world's creation, as the sea creatures began their life in the ocean, the gods asked how the animals would serve mankind. Some said that they would protect humans, while others said that they would help or guide human travelers along the rivers, lakes, and oceans. However, the sea slug did not answer, unable to decide for themselves how to best serve humanity, nor whether to say anything at all. In their silence, the gods grew tired of the sea slug's indecisiveness and cursed them to remain silent and indecisive to the very end, connecting the back-and-forth nature of the Huragok in their single-minded pursuit of information and technology, as seen with the Huragok quick to adjust, helping humanity in Halo 3 ODST, and the many Huragok who were assigned to help build and maintain the UNSC's Infinity. Connecting back to the Huragok's initial designs for jellyfish, we can connect folklore to the Australian continent. For the Aboriginals of Australia, the Yurganji people viewed the jellyfish as extremely intelligent and wise, as they followed the currents and were not quick to act. One day, the chief's son Najar, against his father's wishes, swam deep into the ocean, where the boy met the chief of the jellyfish, a monstrous creature that could easily engulf the young boy, but instead spoke to him. The jellyfish told the boy of the importance of listening, not only to nature, but to his elders and peers. This helped the boy to understand that patience allows all to learn and listen to what is happening around them. For the Huragok, there is no rushing in the work that they do or in their methods of comprehension. Though they are able to work quickly with high accuracy, they move relatively at their own pace, seen within the series casually floating around the area, helping whoever needs help within their group. As well, the Huragok are exceptionally intelligent and are able to comprehend different languages and nuances even after only a few interactions with certain species. This then leads to our next species to join the Covenant, the Lekgolo.
And with reasoning and much labor, these could be used to serve the Covenant.
Hailing from the planet Te, and one of its moons within the sphere system, the Lekgolo are worms that have the unique ability to form a singular gestalt. Existing primarily as individual worms, they show no signs of higher intelligence as individuals, but are distinctly capable of communicating and bonding with one another on a physical and neurological level, increasing their intelligence. This then creates the collective, known to humans as hunters, that is both fierce and poetic. Meaning the Serpent Union. Their species name, Office Congregatio, shows these worms merging together to form their collective. What's interesting is that their species name is actually a union of both Greek and Latin, as the term ophis or office translates to serpent in Greek, while the word congregatio is Latin, translating to union or congregation. Attesting to the thought of snakes and a collective gestalt is the term legion, or many in one, a term found within the book of Mark, chapter 5, sections 7 through 10, in the Christian Bible that reads, "He shouted at the top of his voice, 'What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me.' For Jesus had said to him, 'Come out of this man, you impure spirit.' Then Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' 'My name is Legion,' he replied, 'for we are many.' And he begged again and again not to send them out of the area." Here, the story shows how a man is possessed by multiple demons and proclaims the name of Legion, many in one. Typically, possession takes place as one demon takes over the body and mind of a singular person. However, for whatever reason, multiple demons take possession of a man to create their collective, Legion. Signifying the power over the collective of demons, this story is told twice more within the Christian Bible, in books Luke chapter 8, sections 26 through 33, and Matthew chapter 8 again, sections 28 through 32. In addition, the term Legion often referred to the Roman army's unit consisting of thousands of soldiers. Originally starting as a 100-man unit during the 6th century BCE, the Legion, or Legio to the Roman Republic, acted as a singular unit, fighting, moving, and working together in complete unison with each other soldier, dressing identically to one another. This showed that even if a soldier did die in battle, their place would be immediately taken to keep the whole unit together as a singular entity. This sort of act and strength in uniformity is what the Christian story of the demons calling themselves Legion is potentially referencing, highlighting the definitive power over the Legion, both physically and spiritually. Touching back on the homeworld of the Lekgolo, Te, it's worth noting that their history with the Forerunners dates back thousands of years. As the Forerunners were studying the many species of the Milky Way, they came upon the Lekgolo. Known then as the Lekgolo, they set up an installation around the planet. It's with the ring that they attempted to not only understand the Lekgolo, but attempt to utilize the worms to their benefit in order to fight the ever-expanding parasitic flood invasion. Years later, during the early days of the Covenant, the Sanshayum learned of the Lekgolo's existence, sending an arbiter to study their physiology and the reason for the destruction of the Forerunner installation. However, it's on the moons of Te that the Covenant learned of the secret of the Lekgolo, the secret of Te. In Taoism, a philosophical belief on the way of the universe, Te is a compelling look into the connections between man and the universe at large. Emerging from China during the 5th century BCE, Taoism is believed to be both a philosophy and a religious belief that originated from the teachings of the legendary Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. According to Lao Tzu, Taoism teaches its followers, especially the rural working class, to go with the flow, or as the literal translation of the word Tao states, flow with the natural way of the universe. Many of these teachings and perspectives are shared within the collective texts known as the Tao Te Ching, which can be roughly translated as the Book of the Way and of Virtue. It's here that we're able to get our first look into the terminology of Taoism with the word Te. Meaning either virtue or power, Te revolves around the person and their actions. What I mean by this is that Te not only means a person's moral standards and ethical beliefs, but as well their literal way of life in relation to these aspects. In essence, Te is the sense that comes from a person's actions concerning the Tao, or the flow of the universe, providing a poetic look on the universe through the drudge and turbulence that life brings about. This is appropriate for the Lekgolo, as much of the attitudes and personalities of many of the worms, both individual and together, revolve around the flow of the universe. This can be seen through the multiple fights the Lekgolo take part in, as they trample through lesser species and take significant damage in battle, but continue to move without issue. In addition, it's believed that many of the Lekgolo didn't even follow many of the beliefs within the Great Journey, only having a vague thought of what the afterlife actually was. Even within the books like Ghost of Onyx, the Lekgolo are able to tear through enemies and pause to recite poetry, signifying that this gestalt follows its own path through the fights in their lives. On the topic of poetry, the Taoist texts of the Tao Te Ching are actually written out as poetry, and are meant to be read in such a way that would ease a person into this way of life, instead of having hard-set restrictions and straightforward dialogue like many of the other texts. Taoism insists on going with the flow and taking moments to pause and reflect on their universe. As I had mentioned before, the Lekgolo are extremely capable and fierce fighters within the Halo universe. Giving some background, the Lekgolo, when coming together to form their hunter composition, are known as the Mega Lekgolo, a form so powerful that the Lekgolo begin to lose control of all their senses, forcing the collective of worms to separate into two separate beings, creating a bonded pair. This is why every fight against them is against two hunters. What's notable is that as this bonded pair is synced in some way, be it telepathically or chemically, if one is killed, the other will go into an extreme frenzy, going berserk, that in their rage they will kill any in their way, including their own forces. This kind of berserker rage is reflective of the ancient warriors of both the Scandinavian people and the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe. Known as berserkers, or berserkirs in Old Norse, these warriors were extremely fierce in their fighting style and were able to withstand massive amounts of damage before they succumbed to their wounds. These warriors were supposedly first seen during Rome's conquest of Dacia in the 1st century CE, where legionnaires witnessed large men wearing no armor save for a bear or a wolf cloak, fighting like animals, taking down multiple soldiers before their own demise. These northern forces were said to growl, howl, roar, bite, and tear at enemy forces so fiercely that many began to believe that these men were truly animals, or took on the spirit of the animal they wore the cloak of. This thought of the ferociousness of the berserkers began to form the legends that we would come to know today. The legends, as time went on, told that these men physically transformed into the beasts that they represented, becoming a true aspect of the animal these fighters worshipped with such enthusiasm. One of the most well-known cases of this legend is seen within Egil's Saga by Snorri Sturluson, where the warrior Skallagrimsson takes his men to see about his brother's murder. It states, 12 of them, that's if you call them men, for they're built and shaped more like trolls than men. In another tale, the Saga of King Rolf Kraki, dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries CE, it provides the term Hamramr, or the berserkers who held the ability to transform fully into the beast that they fought so fiercely as. In the story, one moment shares that the berserker Bodvar Bjarki takes the shape of a giant bear. Fighting for King Rolf Kraki, Bodvar is able to take down multitudes of soldiers before finally falling in battle. As some of the fiercest warriors within the Covenant, the Lekgolo are some of the most fascinating throughout the Halo series. Not only are they extremely deadly, both at a distance and close up, they are fascinating to learn and understand, or at least attempt to understand. Capable of bloodthirsty rage, but as well thoughtful reflection on their actions and their way of life within the universe. The collective, that is the Lekgolo, are unlike many others seen within the Halo series, but they are not the only ones who thrive on the collective legions that make up their species.
Line them up!
What the hell are those things, Sergeant?
Drones! The whole swarm! Take them down! Short control burst!
First appearing in Halo 2 in the very first mission, the Yanme'e are an insectoid species that are meant to be an overwhelming force against their enemies, forcing combatants to panic and lose their focus in a firefight. As a sentient insect species, they work together in massive groups and have developed a caste system within their society. Hailing from the planet Palomok, the Yanme'e were the next species to join the Covenant in their quest for the Great Journey. Existing as a developed hive mind, the Yanme'e follow the bidding of their queens, whose sole purpose is to continuously produce offspring and order them to protect the hive by any means. What's interesting with this is that the name Yanme'e in Latin is Turbis Rex, which translates to ugly king. An interesting species name, as they are an unequivocally matriarchal society. This is how the Covenant was actually able to command the Yanme'e, as the San Shayum wavered peace with them and began forming hives within High Charity, providing a never-ending supply of infantry for the war effort. Throughout history, we've seen a plethora of tales, legends, and myths that portray insects in many different ways. For some, in ancient times, insects revealed the origins of people, terrible omens, and sometimes even resurrection. Some of the earliest accounts date as far back as Babylon, seeing insects interacting with gods or even being symbols of them in some fashion. It's worth mentioning that some insects did have greater roles than others, with bees being seen as some of the most important, especially in stories from ancient Egypt to ancient Greece and even early Hinduism. In Egypt, it was believed that bees were formed from the tears of Ra when they touched the desert sand. From this, bees were held in high regard as gifts and were used to develop honey for the gods. For the ancient Greeks, the Greeks viewed bees as gifts from the Olympians. Worshipping the god of beekeeping, Aristeas, they held beekeeping as one of the most admirable roles in society. Being the son of Apollo and the princess of Thessaly, Cyrene, Aristeas was believed to be a gentle soul, who cared for insects while being raised by the spring nymphs of the Thriae. However, After the inadvertent death of Eurydice, the wife of Orpheus, Aristeus' bees would begin to die out. Sacrificing bulls and cows to the Olympians, Aristeus would come to find his bees returned and given divine life. As for ancient Sumeria, they would see lesser insects like flies play a pivotal role in different myths and beliefs. In one Sumerian poem, the goddess of divine beauty Inanna loses her husband, Dumuzid, the demigod of agriculture. Thinking he was dead, the goddess mourns for days, unable to move. However, a small fly comes to her, revealing that her husband is still alive and knows his location, allowing them to reunite. Flies, though small and seemingly annoying, proved to be a powerful assistant to the gods and messengers for them. Being that many would revolve around rotting corpses, flies would come to be associated with the Mesopotamian god of death, Nergal. His followers, seeing the flies as omens of Nergal's presence and actions, leading many to keep the small flying insects alive, even in their pervasive abundance. Furthermore, when we look at the physiology of the Yanme'e, we can see that they take on some inspiration from the most common insects that we see here on Earth, with their buzzing wings as they fly being close to the flies or horseflies, and their matriarchal society being akin to a bee colony. However, many Yanme'e seen in firefights throughout the Halo series share similarities with beetles here on Earth, with many having similar head shapes, thoraxes, and wings to the many types of beetles that we see here today. Moreover, beetles have as well been held with admiration within the ancient world for religious and cult worship purposes. Specifically, the dung beetle and other scarabs like it were revered in ancient Egypt as symbols of death and rebirth. The Egyptians would even have Khepri, the scarab-faced god, be their eternal symbol for the rising sun, representing the beginning of a new day, or rebirth. Because of this association with the god Khepri, the scarab would be highly sought after as a token for those who had died, seeing either the scarab itself or an amulet in its image as meaning the person who had just died was capable of resurrection and rejuvenation in the afterlife. Additionally, many of Khepri's followers would either wear live scarabs or amulets of the scarab to ward off illnesses due to its power. This kind of association towards death and rebirth with the scarab is fitting with the Yanme'e, as they are one of the only species within the Covenant that are consistently producing more and more troops to replace those that die in battle. Even as many of them die, the Yanme'e, or drones as humanity would call them, would take soldiers down with them again and again, using their massive numbers to overwhelm their opponents. Which, speaking of drones, brings up the fact of their standing within their own society. As I had mentioned before, the Yanme'e exist and work within a caste system. For those who don't know what I mean by this, I'll take a moment to explain. A caste is a fixed societal group within a larger hierarchy of people, where a single individual exists exclusively in their group, and cannot work up through the hierarchy, consisting of priests and scholars at the top, rulers and their administration under them, then the farmers and merchants, manual laborers, and then finally untouchables. In essence, if an individual was born as a farmer, that person would grow up to be a farmer, marry a farmer, and then die as a farmer. For the Yanme'e, they primarily existed as laborers within the Covenant society, and had no way of growing through the ranks into a higher status, with races like the Sangheili or Jiralhanae. Moreover, the Yanme'e had their own caste system within their species, where the queen would sit at the top, with the reproductive males under her, then the workers and soldiers, and then finally the unmutuals. This showcases a clear and similar hierarchy that we see within a caste system. This type of societal system is said to originate from the Hindu god of creation, Brahma. As a god with 4 heads and 4 arms, it was believed that Brahma divinely interpreted this divisive societal placement for India's people since the Vedic period 3,000 years ago. It was believed that the Brahmin, or the priests and scholars, had come from Brahma's mouth to speak his divine words and educate his creations of his divine influence. Then the Kshatriya, or rulers and warriors, came from Brahma's hands to strike any opposing forces and write the laws of the land. Next was the Vaishya, or the merchants and farmers, emerging from Brahma's thighs to provide strong pillars of both economic and physical growth for the masses. Then finally the Sudra, or manual workers, coming from Brahma's feet so as to signify the hardened souls of the working class, holding up the rest of the body. For if they failed, the rest could not stand or walk. However, what isn't fully mentioned are the untouchables or unmutuals, as I had mentioned before, as this was a societal group that was excluded from the caste hierarchy due to their status. As they were the poorest people, they were unfit for manual labor and were deemed below the 4-fold Varna, or the belief of Brahma's hierarchy within Hinduism. What's more is that if any individuals within the hierarchy helped or interacted with any untouchable, they would then be demoted from their group and excommunicated. For the Yanme'e, their lives exist solely to serve their queens, who in turn serve the Covenant. Nonetheless, the Yanme'e do not actually follow the Covenant's full beliefs of the Great Journey, as seen with the Sangheili, Jiralhanae, and Sangheili. Instead, following orders from a higher authority, even if it means their death and total replacement, allowing this species to fully take on the aspect of their human-given names, drones. As drones do not ask questions, nor do they think of anything else besides obeying a higher power, serving, killing, and dying in the name of their queen. In starting this great journey, I've gone from game to game and invested a lot of time, energy, and honestly tears since Halo CE's release in 2001. However, it's only been recently that I've come to learn more about and better understand not only the games themselves, but the lore and the on-the-nose references to religion and mythology. In our previous excursions, we delved into the megalomania with the Sangheili, explored the sanctity within the Sangheili, the capability of the Huragok, the ferocious poetry of the Lekgolo, and the system of the Yanme'e. This is all to say that the races of the Covenant are not only varied in their actions and connections, but also varied in their different belief systems and their connections to mythology. As a Saurian race, the Kig-yar are one of the main infantry units seen within the Covenant, functioning primarily as snipers, scouts, and armored units meant to catch enemies off guard. This role for the Kig-yar is especially apparent in Halos 2 and 3, as playing through the Legendary difficulty will have you throwing your controller through the TV due to how easily these enemies take you out. Referred to as Jackals by humans, the Kig-yar were one of the first species among the hegemony of the Covenant to encounter humanity. However, the Kig-yar would have a complicated relationship with humanity, as many of their interactions, prior to the Human-Covenant War, were thought to hold prosperous trade agreements, but instead became violent exchanges, as humans were continually seen as inferior to the Kig-yar, with many being hunted, killed, and even eaten in some cases. This is how the moniker Jackal began, as the animal is a fierce and nimble wild dog that has been known, especially in ancient times, to be an opportunistic hunter. These dogs originated from the African continent, being seen typically eating away at dead animals that they had either hunted and killed or had come across as a free meal. More specifically, within Egypt's borders, a specific subspecies called the golden jackals, or Egyptian wolves, were seen carrying off dead bodies to their dens, oftentimes seen around not only the corpses of smaller prey, but as well human remains, as bodies would be dug up and eaten by jackals, which resulted in Egyptian priests changing their burial procedures during Egypt's early days some 8,000 years ago. This, in turn, would craft an Egyptian god of the dead, of the underworld, and of funerary rites. Anubis. Referred to as Anpu by the Egyptians, Anubis was seen as the deity of the dead, a guide who aided those who had passed, no matter the means, into the underworld to be judged. We'll be exploring that in just a minute, but these roles as a guide and guardian of the dead were not his only role. Depending on the context of a person's passing, whether rich or poor, Anubis played some role in their processing. For instance, Anubis was, as well, the god of embalming, or the process of preserving the human body and sometimes animal bodies by preventing or stalling decomposition. This method was exhaustive and deserves a video of its own to discuss. The guys over at the Thought Emporium actually go over this entire process in really good detail, so if you want to check them out, I've placed a link in the description for you to watch. In essence, the processing of a body involved the removal of the brain and internal organs, then drawing out the body of any and all moisture. Finally, the body would be wrapped tightly in linen and sealed within a sarcophagus. Throughout this process, the priests of the dead would invoke their god Anubis to aid in the embalming process, refraining from letting the body smell of rot, as this would prevent or hinder the person from being able to use their body in the afterlife. This is why many of the priests during the mummification process often wore headdresses or masks of Anubis to not only represent his presence and guidance, but also his invocation. I should mention that the Egyptians, throughout their mummifying of bodies between the 5th dynasty to around the 5th century CE, believed that the heart was the soul of a person, as the heart would beat non-stop, and was the organ connected to the rest of the necessary organs for survival. Many believed that it was the heart that housed who and what a person truly was, which actually leads to our next point with Anubis. In the time between the pre-dynastic period to around the 4th century CE, Anubis was passionately worshipped and was seen as the primary deity of the dead. However, after the death and rebirth of the god Osiris sometime during the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, Anubis would pass on his role as the primary god of the underworld to Osiris. Thankfully, Anubis would continue this tradition as a psychopomp as time went on. See, as a person died, they would be greeted by Anubis and brought into the underworld. There, Anubis would task them with announcing the 42 judges of Ma'at. If the person was able to do that, showing their devotion to their belief, Anubis would then take their heart and weigh it against the feather of Ma'at. During this time, the person would confess all of their wrongdoings, as well as confessing all of their good deeds, proclaiming that they were without sin. If their heart balanced with the feather, then that person would be allowed to enter into the field of reeds, or known as Seket Aru, living out their eternity in peace. This was as well written down by the god of truth, Thoth, and given to Osiris for record keeping and acceptance into his divine domain. However, if this person's heart did not balance with the feather and instead weighed more, their heart would be devoured by the beast, Amet, erasing that person from existence. Throughout the Halo series, the Jackals have a distinct connection to death, especially through many of the fights, and unfair advantages in the series. You know which part I'm talking about. As they were not only the cause of many deaths for so many players, but as well with how many have been killed throughout the series. Looking at the different games from the main series to the Forerunner saga, and even Halo Reach, we have seen unique variations on the Jackals. all of these are Kig-yar, but all of these are varied given the region they originated from. The Rutian, deriving from the main continent of Rut, on their home planet of Ian. The Ibishan, deriving from a small volcanic continent of Ibish. And finally, the Tavoan, who hailed from a colonized asteroid of Tavo. So as these different subspecies of Kig-yar fight to the death, and have easily become associated with death, so too did the Jackals of Egypt result in the subspecies in creating an association with death. Speaking on the variations of the Kig-yar, the Tavoan have only been seen in Halo Reach and a 2017 comic series, which has a lot of fans of the series asking what happened to the subspecies, and where were they during the events of the two main sagas. Currently, it's believed that a majority of the Tavoans were used in the attack on Reach, and being the primary infantry units as skirmishers, their numbers were decimated in the assault, resulting in the subspecies being nearly wiped out. Along with the attack on High Charity during the events of Halos 2 and 3, it brought the Tavoan to a halt in their usefulness. Of course, this is all speculation, but let me know what you think down in the comments. Now, this actually brings up an interesting fact about the Kig-yar that connects their Saurian ancestry. What I mean by this is that the Kig-yar are both reptilian and avian, meaning that, specifically the females, are capable of a process known as parthenogenesis, a natural ability of asexual reproduction, where if a species or even subspecies is suffering from depleted numbers, they can produce more offspring to increase their population. Essentially, the females produce an embryo without the need for fertilization, making a near identical copy of themselves. This might be why we see so many Kig-yar throughout the series, as they are able to produce a higher population in so little time, much like the Unggoy we'll be exploring later on. Something I find fascinating is that this process is found in both nature and even different religions around the world, with the term parthenogenesis translating to virgin creation, with parthenos meaning virgin and genesis meaning creation. For the Egyptians, it was believed that vultures were entirely female and reproduced asexually. As well, the vultures were held in such reverence that pharaohs declared the Egyptian vultures as avatars of the gods, and if they were killed or harmed in any way, a person could be sentenced to death. Being that these birds were scavengers, they revolved around the dead and were believed to reshape a corpse from their mortal lives into the afterlife. Along with this was the belief by those living within Heliopolis especially that Ra, the Egyptian sun god, was the product of this process of parthenogenesis. Being a god of creation, it would only be fitting that his own birth would be in this unique way. The story goes that in the beginning, before there was even time, chaos and the watery darkness was all that existed. This was called Nun, and from Nun came a primordial hill called the Benben, a stone mound that was believed to be the very first pyramid and the precursor of the obelisks found throughout Egypt. From this mound came Ra, a sun rising that gave light to the universe. His first name came to be Atum while in Nun, but as he gave light and life to the universe, he took on the name Ra, formulating his station as the sun god. As mentioned before, the act of parthenogenesis was common throughout other religions. One notable birth in myth was the birth of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war within the Greek pantheon. In brief, Zeus was told of a prophecy that claimed that any child born from the Oceanid Metis would overpower him in nearly every way. Being that Zeus was currently in an affair with Metis, he quickly swallowed her, just as his father did to him and his siblings. However, later on, Zeus began to feel excruciating pain in his head, and requested Hermes and Hephaestus to relieve the pain. Quickly, they cracked open Zeus's head, and Athena erupted from him, fully grown, donning weapons of war and golden armor. Another mention of parthenogenesis, and the most well-known act of it, is the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. Seen in the books of Matthew and Luke of the Christian Bible, it states the archangel Gabriel came down from heaven as a messenger of God. He met with the newly coupled Joseph and Mary in the city of Nazareth of Galilee. Here, Gabriel proclaimed that the Holy Ghost was conceived within Mary. After some time, Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem, but in their time there, the baby had to be born. As parthenogenesis is a fairly common occurrence among the many species here on Earth, it is rare to see it occur outside our corner of the Milky Way. But seeing the jackals take part in this act provides further connections to the mythology that helps create the Kig-yar species. Whether it's the varying subspecies of the Kig-yar, the Rutian, Ibishan, and the Tavoan, connecting back to the subspecies of jackals seen in ancient Egypt, and the linking to the god of death, Anubis. The Kig-yar have a fascinating relation to the mythology that inspires them and the lore behind their species within the Covenant. However, the connections don't just end there, as another species to join the Covenant soon after them acts as not only their rivals in the Halo series, but as an interesting look into fanaticism.
Good thing that food nipple's waiting for me at the starship, cause man, if I worked up a big, crunchy thirst!
As the most common enemy throughout the Halo series, the Unggoy are surprisingly short, unintended, on mythical connections. However, that isn't to say that they are without links to myths, legends, and even history. Originally hailing from the planet Balaho, the Unggoy, known as Grunts by humanity, are one of the primary infantry species within the Covenant, and the next species to join right after the Kig-yar. Being described as an ape-like species, the Unggoy thrive in large numbers, working under a single leader. However, if their leader is killed in battle or decommissioned in any way, they will subsequently run in fear. In their workings within the Covenant, the Unggoy are primarily used as cannon fodder and laborers. Being treated as slaves, the Unggoy are seen as the lowest form of quote-unquote intelligent life within the Covenant. Hated by nearly every race among the hegemony, especially the Kig-yar, the Unggoy were nearly fully sterilized, and subsequently rebelled in 2462. Known as the Grunt Rebellion, this gave the Unggoy a standing among the races, as they had devastated High Charity, thus creating the newfound standing that we see at the start of the series. For the Unggoy, they were given the designation Monachus Frigus, which means cold monk in Latin. When inspecting the thoughts behind the given name, the term monk could relate to the monks who tirelessly studied and worked in monasteries throughout Europe during the medieval period. Dating between the 6th and 15th centuries, monks were religious laborers within monasteries who spent nearly every waking hour transcribing the Christian Bible and similar religious texts, devoting themselves to a life without material possessions to gain a higher understanding of God's work and words. To show this, and what I believe is the true connection of the term monachus, is the specific hairstyle of the monks during that time. Known as a tonsure, the hairstyle was relegated to 3 specific styles to show a monk's utmost devotion to their faith and the work within the monasteries. Of the 3, it's the coronal Roman or Petrine style that we'll be focusing on with this, as this hairstyle showcased a clean-shaven head while leaving a ring of hair around the head, otherwise known as a crown or halo, with halos being a symbol of divinity within multiple religions and even cult worship. Leaving a crown of hair for all to see shared with others that this monk followed their faith to a T. desiring to be as close to divinity as was possible or allotted. Moreover, the coronal tonsure was meant to share the likeness of the crown of thorns that Christ had worn during his crucifixion. Of course, the tonsure described is not the only one or is exclusive to the medieval monks, as the acts of cutting or shaving hair from one's head is seen throughout the world. For instance, in Buddhism, the rite of pabaja has people become ordained as monks by shaving their heads and faces clean. As well, within Hasidic Judaism, men and boys are allowed to shave their heads but must leave their side locks, called peyots, untouched, as stated in Leviticus 19:27. For the Unggoy, the reasoning behind this connection is that when examining the look of this species, it's easy to see that all of them have bald heads like the monks would. The fact that monks outwardly showed their devotion to their faith is another link to this, as the Unggoy worked in this fashion as well, with some having an extreme fanaticism towards the Great Journey. Though many of the Unggoy only followed the Shanshayum's belief in the Great Journey out of fear of annihilation, some showed a level of devotion through their violent bombings. For anyone who may be uncomfortable with this topic, I've put a timestamp up if you want to jump ahead. For those of you who have stayed, let's continue. These acts of unaliving oneself is not uncommon throughout history, and even in religious worship. As the act seen from the outside looking in, it paints the picture of someone taking their own life, either out of desperation or in their religious fervor. However, from that individual's perspective, it's seen as an act of self-sacrifice, a motive that can drive many to do the same in the name of something greater than themselves. For the Unggoy, they had specific squads that were meant to do bombings exclusively in this way to either demoralize their foes or take out as many as possible to halt their enemies' progress. In religious and cult worship, the act is a tricky subject, as many condemn it outright, while some accept it as a sign of their faithfulness and control. For many in both antiquity and even today, humanity was seen as a gift given by the gods, and the specific act can be considered as an act of rebellion against the gods. In Greek myth and legend, the story of Antigone and the overarching story of Oedipus touches on this act itself. Written in play form by Sophocles, the story shares that Antigone, the daughter of Oedipus, must stay with his rival of Thebes, Creon, whose son is set to marry Antigone. However, in Creon's hubris for control and hatred towards the gods, he denies the mourning of Oedipus and his brothers Eteocles and Polynices after their deaths. By doing so, he condemns his own son, Haemon, his wife Eurydice, and Antigone to take their own lives in defiance and desperation. For the Unggoy, the act itself is meant to be explosive and deadly, an act of martyrdom that uses unaliving oneself as a weapon of mass destruction. In today's world, we know this all too well, seeing attacks occur that take the lives of men, women, and children. As the world waged its second war in the 1940s, the Japanese military designated specific squads as kamikaze fighters to take out vessels and soldiers in acts of martyrdom, meaning spirit or God's wind. The kamikaze fighter pilots carried explosives into battle and crashed into warships as an act of last resort. What's interesting is that the term kamikaze carries some folklore and history among the Japanese. Dating back to the 13th century, during the rule of the Mongols in East Asia, the Mongolian Empire wanted to expand further east. In their attempt to sail towards Japan, the Mongols faced a harrowing typhoon that devastated a third of their seafaring fleet, killing over 13,000 men. After some years had passed, The Mongols attempted another invasion of Japan, but as they were unable to find suitable landings, another typhoon hit the fleet and decimated over half of the Mongols' forces. In response to this, the Japanese people named the typhoons kamikaze in honor of the gods of wind, sea, lightning, and war: Fujin, Ryujin, Raijin, and Hashiman, as it was these four gods who had protected their land and their people from invading forces, showcasing their divine power. Though unassuming, the Unggoy are a deadly force when given proper provocation and weaponry, whether it's in their fanaticism for the Great Journey or their overwhelming numbers. The Unggoy attack an enemy harshly under their leaders.
Tartarus, the prophets have betrayed us. No, Arbiter! The great journey has begun, and the brutes, not the elite, shall be the prophet's escort.
As a race of incredible strength and ferocity, the Jiralhanae, known to humans as brutes, have become one of the central antagonists within the Halo series. Described as a gorilla-like sapient species, they are extremely capable and were the last species to join the Covenant in 2492, just 33 years before the start of the Human Covenant War in 2525. First introduced in Halo 2, the Jiralhanae are direct rivals to the Sangheili, taking over their role within the Covenant as the protectors of the Shan Shayum and warriors of the Great Journey. It's with the Great Schism that we witness just how powerful and even how faithful the Jiralhanae are when driven by a divine purpose. However, their brutality and dominating nature stems from the fact that they are a predatory species, meaning that they are in a constant pursuit of control and of food sources. Which, speaking of food, the Jiralhanae are particularly fond of devouring their enemies no matter the size, emphasizing their propensity for violence. Originating from the planet Doisak, the Jiralhanae have primarily existed as tribal societies where each tribe was led by a singular chieftain, a role which has daunted many players when playing on Legendary, as these chieftains carry their signature gravity hammer, again demonstrating their strong desire for close quarters combat and violence. Thankfully, when looking at the tribal nature of the Jiralhanae, it can actually provide our first look into the relationship with mythology. For many tribes of the ancient world, like the Gauls, Thracians, and Iberians, they were considered barbarians by the great civilized nations, with nations like Rome and the Greeks before them taking up arms against these tribal and nomadic people because of their way of life and religious worship. For many, they followed a polytheistic belief just like their opposing factions. However, due to their less organized social and religious structure, these tribes would associate deities with an element, a specific tribe, or even a place. For instance, the Thracian goddess of the moon and hunting, Bendis, was fervently worshipped in groves and wooded areas during the late Bronze Age. The worship of Bendis would actually find its way into the Greek pantheon with the goddess Artemis, the deity of the moon and hunting. For the worship of idols, also known as idolatry, it was a practice seen throughout the ancient world before and even during the rise of the Abrahamic religions. Societies like the tribes described, as well as the Egyptians and the Vedic people, were all practitioners of idol worship, as these idols were considered the conduits of cult worship, acting as a physical embodiment of a god, goddess, or even the divine powers for worshippers to provide offerings to and proclaim their devotion. These idols could take the form of statues in a god's likeness, slates of a god's representation, or even small icons meant for veneration while on the move. Concerning the Jiralhanae, prior to their conversion to the Covenant religion. Their tribes, or clans, throughout their homeworld of Doisak practice primarily idol and totem worship, with each clan having their own totem of worship to their ancient pantheon, much like the ancient worship of the Thracian goddess Bendis, where the Thracian people would provide offerings to their idol of the moon. So too did the Jiralhanae with their totems of worship. This is because their worship as well revolved quite literally around the lunar cycles of Doisak's 3 moons, Wariel, Soryapt, and Tish. Being much like Earth, Doisak's moons affected the tides and displayed cycles between new and full moons, swaying the Jiralhane's beliefs towards their gods and hunting rights, as the moon was capable of providing light in the night, but can provide some notion of omens with their disappearance and reappearance. As for totem worship, known as totemism, they function much like the idols expressed earlier. However, it's with totems that each clan or tribe of the Jiralhanae can dictate their heritage and lineage. Comparatively, the totem poles of the native people of North America use these poles to signify their connections to different elements, animals, spirits, and even timelines, with many relating to the classification of people or even the natural protector of their group. Of course, the indigenous people of North America were not the only ones to practice this, as in one study by Goldenweiser in 1910, they found that totems of varying sizes in Australia of the Aranda people were used in ceremonies consisting of stone rubbing, rock decoration, and even bloodletting, all made in efforts to strengthen not only their own bonds to their totem animal, but to strengthen the animal or representation of that said animal, thus strengthening their people in the coming seasons. Being given the designation Servus Ferox by the Forerunners, meaning wild slave in Latin, the brutes exemplify their wild nature throughout the series, noting that when they are at their most vulnerable, they become slaves to their brutal nature, acting as wild animals in an absolute fit of rage. Much like the Mega Lekgolo in their rage after losing their bond brother, the Jiralhanae will go berserk in a gorilla-like fury, even becoming stronger in some cases. What's interesting to observe is that the brutes' designs come from what we see with Earth's gorillas and their pack or family group behavior, with a single silverback taking a leadership role within the group, just like what is seen in Halo 2 with Tartarus, the only silver and white brute among the others, sharing with us, the player, that he is their leader, their chieftain. As for present-day gorillas, we acknowledge their existence within the jungles and forests of Africa. However, for a period of time, these great apes were considered a myth by much of the world until their discovery in 1847, written about and studied by Thomas Savage and Jeffries Wyman in their book The Proceedings of the Boston Society of Natural History. They describe what they called troglodytes gorilla, later named the Western gorilla. Here, the naturalists categorized the apes into the orang grouping, pairing the gorillas to the orangutans seen in Central and Southern Asia. What ultimately makes this classification mythical, and even relating back to the Jiralhanae as ape-like, is the epithet wild men, a similar calling to the name wild slave for the Jiralhanae. For the Hubei province of central China, people for seemingly thousands of years have believed in creatures called Yeren. In the folklore of the region, the people believe that these Yeren are wild men and slaves to their violent instincts, desiring large quantities of food and women to have their way with above all else. One of the first instances of these wild men dates back to China's Warring States period in ancient poems written by Qu Yuan during the 3rd century BCE, describing these creatures as large and hairy humanoid spirits who act out their most basic and violent instincts. Out of these folktales of the Yeren, we can relate them to the violent and brutish nature of the Jiralhanae, as many of them display similar features with the descriptions of not only the Yeren, but of orangutans and gorillas, with somewhat elongated faces, broad and flattened nostrils, as well as ape-like fur covering much of their body. I should mention that along with their Latin name connecting with Chinese folklore, the title of brutes given to the Jiralhanae by humanity holds its fair share of links to myths and legends. See, the word itself, brute, derives from the Latin word brutus, meaning dull or stupid, a word that has had a lasting impression with the legendary assassination of Julius Caesar, as well as a subtle connection to the origin of Britain. In the first, a political and supposed friend to Julius Caesar, Marcus Junius Brutus, saw the tyrannical leadership of Caesar and had secretly joined with a group known as the Liberatores. Wanting to free Rome and her people from Caesar's regime, this group and the other senators gathered together to assassinate Julius Caesar. On that faithful day of the Ides of March, now known as the 15th of March, Brutus was the first to strike Caesar in the back, stabbing him deep, then letting each senator strike, leaving Caesar bloodied and dead on the Senate floor. It's worth mentioning that this story of the historic death has been mythicized over the last 2,000 years, sparking dozens, if not hundreds, of retellings, embellishments, and misconceptions, such as the final phrase uttered by Caesar, et tu, Brute, meaning, and you, Brutus. As for the second connection with the Latin word Brutus, we can look to the origin of Britain and its supposed founder and first king, Brutus of Troy. The story of Brutus is a little complicated, as it takes notes from historical moments while adding in some biases and differing perspectives. The story goes that as the city of Troy fell after its decade-long war with the Mycenaean Greeks, a prince of Troy, Aeneas, sailed from the ruins being promised a land of salvation for his people. After founding Italy and ruling as king, Aeneas had his sons take up his rule after his time as king. One of his sons, Ascanius, was to have his own son brought into the world. However, a magician or soothsayer came to them, informing them of the child's incredible fate that would rival that of Aeneas. After the boy's birth, his mother soon after died from the pains of childbirth. Seeing how his wife died in such a brutish way, and angered towards the child, Ascanius would name his son Brutus. As the boy grew older, he became a fierce warrior for his country, but in an accident had mortally wounded his father with an arrow. Thus, he was banished from his homeland and set off to wander the world. After his travels, he came upon an island of green hills that he would claim in his own honor and name, calling his new home Britain. Not a bad story at all. However, this has several different variations that confuse the entire narrative. For starters, in the Historia by Virgil and Titus Livius, they don't exactly clarify if Ascanius is really the father of Brutus or if it's Silvius, another of Aeneas' sons. As well, an account by the notable 7th century scholar Isidore of Seville claims in his encyclopedia titled Origines, shares that the name of the country of Britain derives from the word bruti, meaning animalistic or savage, as Isidore was a Roman scholar who viewed the Britons as nothing more than savages and barbarians. Though the first time that the name Brutus is mentioned is in the 9th century account of the Historia Britannium. Much like Herodotus and his written account, the Histories on Greek society, the Histories Britannium dictates some historical events but does also involve myths in the founding of the Britons. All in all, this tale of Brutus is more than likely a mythical creation story for the people of Britain and the land they now live on. With the view of the Britons as savages by Roman scholars, the Jiralhanae of the Halo series are seen just as much by humanity, as well as with the Sangheili seeing the brutes as nothing more than that, brutes. Nevertheless, one brute among the many, Tartarus, the chieftain of the brutes, proves to not be like any normal brute, both in his history and connections to mythology. To briefly explain, Tartarus began his career under the command of his uncle Maccabeus, the ruling chieftain at the start of the Jiralhane's joining with the Covenant. Tartarus would prove himself to be a strong and capable fighter during the skirmishes on Harvest in 2525, where he was able to claim his right as a commander among his squad. Soon after challenging his uncle for the title of chieftain, Tartarus brutally killed Maccabeus in ritualistic fighting, taking not only the title, but his uncle's weapon, the Fist of Huragok, leading to where we encounter the Chief of the Brutes in Halo 2, working as the second in command to the Prophet of Truth. For Tartarus, his name is befitting of his brutal characteristics, as being the name of the deepest part of the underworld in Greek mythology, sitting below Hades, so far down that Hesiod mentions in his writings from Theogony that if an anvil fell from the earth, it would take 9 whole days to reach the very top of Tartarus. Makes you wonder just how far down the Arbiter fell in that pit. But for the Greeks, Tartarus, it was believed to be the prison and punishment for the most wicked among the Greeks. Seeing figures such as the Cyclopes, Hecatoncheires, Kronos, as well as some kings like Tantalus and Sisyphus, to name a few, being locked in eternal torment. For many of these prisoners, they had challenged the ruling power, such as Kronos in the Titanomachy, while others abused the god's powers and wits, like the king Sisyphus. This prison and place of punishment is appropriate in linking the chieftain of the brutes, as he is the one enforcing the punishment against those deemed unworthy or unfit of the great journey, working hand in hand with the prophets to eliminate those deemed heretics in the eyes of the gods. However, being a prison is not the only view that the Greeks had for what Tartarus was, being described again in Theogony as the primordial being of the abyss within Greek cosmology. Being the third son of Chaos, he would bed his sister Gaia, the personification of the earth, and create the precursor to all monsters of Greek myth, Typhon. Sadly, the primordial Tartarus is not discussed in a lot of detail in Greek myth. But when comparing the two, we can find that each bear some resemblance, as both exist as chaotic and gruesome entities in their own universes, with Halo's Tartarus reveling in the erupting chaos within the Covenant, while the Greek Tartarus is believed to revel in the creation of a monster of malice and fire, with both leading to brutal destruction and death. Speaking of death and destruction, it's with Maccabeus, the uncle of Tartarus and former chieftain of the Brutes, who shares their own links to myths and legends. Just as Tartarus upheld his faith in the Forerunners and the Great Journey, as well as the service to the San Shayum, so too did Maccabeus. So much so that many Jiralhanae respected his devotion and leadership. In battle, Maccabeus was a tough fighter, utilizing a potent energy shield that is described in the book Contact Harvest as capable of withstanding hundreds of rounds from assault and battle rifles. As well, Maccabeus was known for his signature weapon, the same weapon that would end up being his demise, the Fist of Huragok. It's with this weapon and Maccabeus' name that allow us to look back to the 2nd century BCE to understand the significance of this chieftain. Between the years 168 and 141 BCE, the land of Judea saw consistent acts of rebellion against the Hellenistic empire of the Seleucid. Ruling for almost 200 years, the Seleucid Empire was a Greek power that used its former Macedonian authority to influence the Asian and Middle Eastern world. However, as the Jewish religion grew in prominence in the land of Judea, the Jewish people revolted against the forced sway of the Greek gods in their everyday life. Leading the rebellion against the Seleucids was Judas Maccabeus, a religious warrior and priest among the Jewish who would see him claim his new name, Judah Maccabee, and begin the dedication ceremony known as Hanukkah that we see today. As the third son of the Jewish priest Matthias, Judas fought directly under his father and proved himself to be a strong leader and tactician in guerrilla warfare. Sadly, Matthias would be captured and crucified, ushering in Judas to lead in his stead. Under his command, Judas would fell the Seleucid forces in such abundance and with such ferocity that in the first year of his supremacy, Judas would claim the surname Maccabee. The reason being that, according to Jewish folklore, the name Maccabee was an acronym for the verse within the Torah, "Who is like you among the heavenly powers, Lord?" a surname that would continue on to represent the forces under Judah's rule during the revolt. In addition, Judah's forces and himself would remove the Greek idols from Judea, purifying the land for their own worship. This act would see the Temple of Jerusalem restored to its original purpose and begin the dedication and reconsecration of the temple, creating the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. This surname connects back to Halo's Maccabeus, as he was one of the most devoted among the Jiralhanae in their belief of the Forerunner gods. In the same way, the Maccabees and Maccabeus are some of the most devoted in their faith of their god, Yahweh. To the connection of the surname Maccabee to the Torah, the name does have an additional connection to its etymology, as the name Maccabee in Aramaic, Maccabah, and modern-day Hebrew, Mekatbet, are the potential origins of the name, with both meaning hammer. Using this moniker signifies just how powerful Judah Maccabee would come to be as both a priest and religious warrior. This again brings us back to Maccabeus of the Jiralhanae, who would use the ceremonial battle hammer, the Fist of Rukt, in his fights against the warring tribes of Jiralhanae before their joining of the Covenant, as well in their first bout against humanity. Though seen and respected as a fierce leader and warrior, it would be his nephew, Tartarus, who would challenge his leadership, leading to Maccabeus' death in ritualistic fighting and loss of his weapon, passing down the role of chieftain and paving the way for the Tartarus that we would come to see in Halo 2. The brutal Hammer of the Covenant, the Maccabah of the Prophet of Truth, the chieftain, the Brutes. It's with the Brutes and the other races of the Covenant whom each connect to the various mythologies around the world that give the Halo series its true depth, as without these connections and inspirations, the Covenant would be, at least in my opinion, just another group of bad guys within the series. Don't get me wrong, the gameplay would be fun and is still fun even to this day, but the mythology found within and around each of these races really provides us a better look into the thoughts and behaviors behind this hegemony of the Halo series. If you've enjoyed this series and want to see more, then let me know down in the comments. A huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel here on YouTube, Twitch, and Patreon. If you'd like to show your support and help keep this channel going, then for just $2 a month, you can join the community of gamers like Sarah Smith, DMT Infinity, and Eric Groth. Links are all in the description. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.